The following presentation, Makers and Shakers, is presented by the City of Flagstaff and APS. Sponsored by Compass BBVA, Pub Medical, AWD Law, Sunwest Bank, Alliance Bank, W.L. Gore and Associates, Gentera Enterprises, and DPR Construction.
Hey, it's a great Friday morning, and you've made it to the end. I'm Scott Hathcock. Once again, it's my great pleasure to host our final day of Moonshot's week-long series, Makers and Shakers, a virtual event to educate and celebrate both startups and aspiring founders. You're going to want to grab a fresh cup of coffee because we've got two final workshops lined up, touching on key building blocks for creating successful startups. They will run 15 to 30 minutes each, and after the workshops, our subject matter experts will be live and online to address and answer any questions or comments you may have at info@moonshotaz.com. And then, later tonight, we have our final happy hour featuring this year's semi-finalist pitches for the Innovate Waste and PPE Responder Challenge. Then we will follow that with a sit-down interview with Charlie Horn. He's a founder and chairman of Five Lights Group, a lifelong entrepreneur, and now he's on a very serious mission to inspire youth entrepreneurs. After Charlie Horn's interview, we will go live and announce this year's Innovate Waste and PPE Responder Challenge winner. Man, that's a lot of words. And maybe even announce a few more surprises. You're not going to want to miss this. This has been a powerful week, don't you think? So let's get our final day started.
Hi, my name is Cassie Petit. I thought before I dive into the heart of my presentation, I would let you know a little bit of background about me. I currently serve as the Assistant Director of Learning and Organizational Development at Northern Arizona University. I've been with NAU for almost 7 years, and prior to working there, I lived in Las Vegas and held a variety of roles in the human resources arena while I worked at both MGM Resorts International and prior to that at Boyd Gaming. If you include my time as a student worker at the University of Iowa in their human resources office, I've been working in this field for 18 years. The human resources, or HR function, of every organization has so many parts to it. There's payroll, benefits, compensation, employee relations, employment, recruiting, training, etc. The foundation of all of these functions for your company absolutely must be your company culture. So let's start with an important question that you might be wondering anyways. Why should you care about any of this? Why should I care about defining culture when I have real work to do? There are so many layers to this question. Why should you care? Like, why should you take the time to define your own mission and company core values? Why should I care can also be asked by your customers or potential customers. Why should I care enough to do business with this organization? Why should I care can also be asked by your employees or potential employees, right? Why should I care enough to make this company a success? So let's start with the foundation of all of these layers that I just talked about, and that's you. We all know that strategy is extremely important for any organization. Your idea for a product, a business, a service is what got you where you are today. The fundamentals of starting a business, things like defining what that product or service it is that you offer, conducting the market analysis, public relations, marketing, and financials are all extremely important. But there also needs to be intentional and strategic thought put into the heart of your business, into defining and communicating out the why of your business. I was half joking earlier when I said the quote about having real work to do, because the culture part of so many organizations seems to have been an afterthought, or, and perhaps worse, it was something that we came up with to put on our website, or great sounding words to put on a poster, and we hang on the walls, but it isn't practiced. So during this presentation, I have a few activities to get you thinking about your own company culture. But before we get into that, let's look at what some of the literature shows about culture. A Harvard Business Review article stated, strategy offers a formal logic for the company's goals and orients people around them. Culture expresses goals through values and beliefs and guides activity through shared assumptions and group norms. That was a lot, so let me give you an example of what that looks like. For example, right now I'm working on a project and we're staffing a brand new team with 5 new positions. So the strategy for this project is, what is the timeline around this new team being up and ready to go? Who's creating the job descriptions for those new positions? What's the recruiting plan, right? If you remember from that quote, strategy is the goals and then orients people toward them. But there's also this culture piece that is equally as important. So the culture piece in my example of creating a new team with 5 new positions is, who is it that we want on this team, right? Who is going to be a good fit for us? Not just in terms of competence and experience, but why do they want to work here? What are their values? Do their values align with our values? And then how do we create really good interview questions to get at that culture piece, to find out what this person's values are and if they'll be a good fit for us? So a few examples of how defining strategy without thought and culture can really cost companies. I'm sure you're familiar with the Wells Fargo scandal, right? So the strategy with Wells Fargo was opening up new accounts. Because the core values and culture hadn't been well defined, it became at any cost necessary. Well, Wells Fargo, not only did their CEO step down, but they were fined about $3 billion. Another example is from Volkswagen. So their strategy was to have low emissions. Without that culture piece being in place, once again, it became at all costs necessary. And not only once, but twice, they created a device that defeated the tests. When that was all found out, Volkswagen's stock price fell about 1/3, and to date, they've been fined about $18 billion. So those are 2 very extreme examples as to what can happen without that culture piece being defined. But in addition to those extreme negative examples, I also want to share with you some benefits of why it's important for you to define your company culture. Starting with identity. Who are you? You get to set the direction, and by doing that, you set an expectation for all potential employees and customers. Before moving to Flagstaff, I previously worked for MGM Resorts International for many years. I started with that company about a year after they had purchased the Mandalay Resort Group, and they were called MGM Mirage. So let me back up a minute. I start working at the Excalibur Hotel and Casino in around 2006. In 2005 is when MGM Mirage had purchased MGM Resort Group. So MGM Mirage owned properties like the Monte Carlo, New York, MGM, Mirage, the Bellagio. The Mandalay Resort Group consisted of the Excalibur, Luxor, Mandalay Bay, and Circus. So when MGM Mirage purchased Mandalay Resort Group, they became a massive organization. So during my time with the company, I got to witness this massive organization create its new identity. In addition to purchasing and building new properties, the revenue of all of those properties in Las Vegas was looking a lot different than it had in the past. A study was done while I was employed there, so this is about 10 years old now, on customer spend while in Vegas. And what we learned was that about 65% of what guests were spending their money on was not gambling. I mention this because even though it's old data, it helped the company in rebranding its identity. So while I'm there, the company's growing. They know that guests aren't spending all their money on just gambling and shrimp cocktail like they used to. So they knew it was time to change their identity. It eventually got them to the tagline that they use to this day, which is "Welcome to the show," right? It's Las Vegas. It's MGM Resorts International. It is all about entertainment. The "Welcome to the show" tagline, what was interesting is it was used both as an external and an internal identity campaign. So the show, SHOW acronym, stood for the 4 customer service standards that was expected of all employees. And the Welcome to the Show tagline really was a promise to our guests to keep them entertained while they were there. Once you establish your identity, you will then look for people to hire who believe in that identity. Or, like with the case with MGM Resorts International, you train the people who work for the company to help reinforce that identity. Another benefit to having a strong culture defined is retention. People want to stay and work at places where they feel that they belong. It is so much easier to attract talented people when you have a strong culture. And actually, according to Gallup research, about 71% of millennials strongly agree that they know what their organization stands for, say they plan to stay with their company for another year. That number drops to 30% for those who disagree. Culture can be a more important factor for people when deciding on where to work than salary, at a certain point, of course. And lastly, let's talk about performance. Organizations with a well-defined culture have an advantage over those with a weak culture. I mean, can you imagine having this well-defined culture and mission and values, and everybody at your workplace feels a part of that? They feel personally connected to your purpose. Like, how engaged would your team be? How does that transfer to your clients and your customers? It does take work, but it can absolutely be achieved. So I want to stick with this performance benefit of a strong culture and talk a little bit about this impact and give you a couple more statistics. So according to a 2020 Gallup research poll, your culture drives your ethics and compliance reporting. So I want to go back to that Wells Fargo and Volkswagen example, thinking about their culture, what was reported, what wasn't reported. In fact, statistics from a New Century Financial Corporation indicate that employees who are actively engaged in their job, right? They're happy to be there, they produce better results. I mean, duh. But a really great example of that is account executives at a banking company who were actively disengaged produced 28% less revenue than those who were engaged. Happy workers, those who are engaged, they are also more likely to solve difficult problems faster. And the reason is simple. People who are unhappy, who don't feel connected to their job, they don't tend to do more than just the minimum. Great workers who don't feel appreciated, who don't feel connected, they quit. And poor managers can negatively affect workers and productivity. So I know the saying is that money cannot buy you happiness, but in looking at some of the research around culture, it sure seems like happiness can buy you money, so to speak. So let's talk a little bit about some benchmark companies. I know there's a lot of different companies out there who have strong cultures, but I just chose these three to highlight to give a high-level overview of some great examples. I specifically chose Zappos because when I lived in Las Vegas, I got to tour the facility. They run tours at Zappos all the time. What I think is so cool about that is not only are they living their culture, but they're also showing others how to do it. In fact, if you're a reader, either Audible or to turn the page, I highly recommend you purchasing Delivering Happiness. Delivering Happiness is a great book that was written by Zappos' former CEO, Tony Hsieh. He actually just stepped down from that position a couple months ago after starting the company and being there for 20 years. The whole entire book is about how, for him, defining the culture and the service standards was the most important thing. It's just a company that happens to sell shoes. I also chose REI because I think they've done such a great job at staying true to their mission values, and visiting their stores, from my experience, the people that work there absolutely love their job. And maybe when I think about their customers, it might just be because of where we live in Flagstaff with how the outdoorsy things to do. But I know so many people who are such loyal customers to REI, like plan their entire weekend around standing in line to get first pick at those garage sales. I also wanted to highlight Southwest Airlines and how they live their mission and their purpose through their decision making, which is as it should be. The mission and values of your organization, as I said earlier, shouldn't just be pretty words on your website or on a poster that you hang on your wall. Your mission and values should guide how you make your decisions and how your company operates. So I wanted to share with you Southwest's purpose and vision, just so you can get a feel for what this looks like. So Southwest on their website has their purpose as they want to connect people to what's important in their lives through friendly, reliable, and low-cost air travel. Their vision is to be the world's most loved, most efficient, and most profitable airline. So let's put all this into practice for you. So I'm going to walk you through a series of activities to get you to start thinking about your own purpose, your own mission, vision, and core values. So it all starts with this question: why do we exist? What I mean by that is, what is your company's purpose? Why are you here and where are you going? To give you an example from another company, Disneyland. Who doesn't love Disneyland? At Disneyland, their common purpose that every cast member needs to know is to create happiness. Every person that works at Disneyland knows that they are here to create happiness and to make magical moments for the guests. And it's not just that they know this, but actions matter. Disney doesn't just say create happiness and then leave everything else to chance. I actually had the opportunity to attend the Disney Institute's workshop on creating a culture of service excellence. And what I learned there was that not only does Disney do a great job at getting publicity by having stories of magical moments out in the public, but they also strategically and intentionally share those stories with all cast members to reinforce the behaviors that are expected. So I went online and found a great heartwarming story from Disneyland I thought I would share with you all, just to give you a feel for what to create happiness and magical moments mean. So a woman who was visiting Disneyland wrote this into the park. When I was 6, my autistic brother and I went to Disneyland for the first time. We decided to go on the Peter Pan ride because that's my brother's favorite character. When we were riding the ride, my brother had a meltdown because he was scared by the heights. When one of the cast members saw us getting off, with my brother still freaking out, she came over to us and told us to wait right outside for something magical. After waiting a few minutes, she and Peter Pan came walking towards us. My brother immediately calmed down and became super excited. We took pictures with him and he signed our autograph books. Then he personally escorted us to our next ride, the carousel. My brother was overjoyed. It is definitely my favorite memory from the Disney parks. So earlier I'd mentioned that I worked at MGM Resorts International. And while I was there, as I told you the story, they went through a whole brand identity campaign. A part of that was asking ourselves this question: why do we exist? You know, we've grown as a company. We're not the same company we were in the 80s or the 90s or even in 2000. And so it was a great time for people to look at why we're here. And what we came up with was why we exist, our purpose, regardless of your title, of how long you've been with the company, was 3 reasons. You are here to engage, to entertain, and inspire the people that you work with and the people that come to stay and play at our properties. So if this was an in-person workshop, I would pause right here and I would have each of you take a couple minutes to start to define your why. Why does your company exist? Why are you here and where are you going? So if you want, I encourage you to pause the video now, get your thoughts down on some paper. It might not be your completed mission statement, but at least this is something to get you thinking, or you can start to make notes for something that you can come back to later as homework. So once you've started to think about why are we here, why do we exist? The next question is, well, what makes you different from everyone else? You know, how will your employees, how will your customers differentiate you from your competitors? Let me circle back to that Southwest example. Remember, their purpose was to connect people to what's important in their lives through friendly, reliable, and low-cost air travel, right? That's what we're doing because our vision is they want to be the world's most loved, most efficient, and most profitable airline. So Simon Sinek is another author I really like. Once again, if you're a reader, start with why. I highly recommend it. But in his book, Start With Why, he gives a great example of how Southwest takes action and makes decisions based on their purpose. So to be the low-cost air travel, right? That's what they want to differentiate them from other airlines. He tells the story about how a flight attendant was getting clients, customers that were asking for chicken sandwiches on flights. So she asked her boss, why don't we offer chicken sandwiches on flights? And her boss responds, if we started doing that, could we still be the low-cost airline? And she said no. And he said, well, that's why we don't do it. Right? So that's what differentiates us from our competitors. There are airlines that offer a wider variety of food than Southwest does, right? But what differentiates them and what's in their purpose and mission statement is to be the low-cost airline. So an example from my own world, when I was at MGM Resorts prior to coming to Flagstaff, I had moved around a lot with the company because I worked there for, oh gosh, about 9 years. Most of the time I was there, though, I worked at the Excalibur. And if you've never been, let me tell you, working every day in a castle is awesome. Like, how seriously can you take yourself when you go to work in a castle every day? But working at the Excalibur, so a little history for those that might not know, the Excalibur opened in 1991. And I had the opportunity to be a part of a process that was really exclusive to the castle. In addition to MGM Resorts as a corporation, thinking about what their identity, what their culture was, we were also having very similar conversations at the property level to define our identity. Who are we? Who is our customer? How do we differentiate ourselves from all these other casinos and hotels in Las Vegas? So these conversations that we were having, you know, we weren't opening. We weren't a new business. We'd been around for about 15 years. And as I was new and coming on to the property, many of the employees that I talked with had been at the Excalibur since day one, since they were the new shiny property on the block in 1991. And remember, in the last couple years, you know, from 2005 on, they had really undergone a lot of change by becoming part of this huge organization. So some of the comments I was hearing from our employees was they were upset that, you know, the MGM Grand or the Mirage or the Bellagio were stealing our Excalibur customers. My first reaction, my thought process was someone that is coming to visit Las Vegas, I don't necessarily see them weighing staying at the Excalibur against staying at the Bellagio. Perhaps I might weigh staying at the Excalibur against staying at the Tropicana or Flamingo, and the Bellagio perhaps against the Aria or Wynn, but it was very clear to me, and it was very clear to our leadership, that we really needed a reset to define for all of us who we are and who our customer is. So we hosted day-long sessions with all of our managers to talk about the Excalibur brand, the Excalibur culture, and what made us different for everyone else. Most of that day was spent talking about our core values. For example, when I started at the Excalibur, we had 4 core values. One of them was fun, which I loved, right? As I said earlier, you work in a castle. It should be fun. So how does that core value of fun differentiate us from others? Let me go back to this Bellagio example. I can guarantee you fun is not one of their core values. I don't mean to say that if you work or stay there, you won't have fun, but they have prioritized other core values there. So how does the core value of fun drive decisions that are made at the Excalibur? A great example of this is Dick's Last Resort. Dick's Last Resort is located at the castle, at the Excalibur, not at Bellagio. If you don't know what Dick's Last Resort is, pause this right now and Google it. I will say their whole thing is, their name is Dick's Last Resort. Like, I wouldn't go there expecting a 5-star dining experience. If you asked for napkins, you probably will get a stack of them thrown at you. So Dick's Last Resort is something that's located at the Excalibur, not at the Bellagio. We used to joke in new employee orientation at the Excalibur that we were home to the largest Dick's in North America. I guarantee they don't share facts like that at the Bellagio. The Bellagio, to maintain their 5-star, 5-diamond rating, needs to talk about other information. So I hope that from these couple examples, it gives you something to think about in defining how your company culture is different from others. So speaking of new employees, Another question for you to get clear on is, what are the top qualities I am looking for in a new employee? So we've thought about what's your why. Why does your company, your product exist? What makes you different from your competitors? Now, what are you looking for when you bring people into your company? At the time I went to the Disney Institute and learned about their service culture, I learned that before people can even apply to be a cast member, they have to watch a video about what it means to be a cast member. I found that so interesting, that starting sort of indoctrinating people into their culture before you can even apply for a job. Even in the language that they use, they don't call their employees employees, they're called cast members. My last year living and working in Las Vegas, I was based at the Luxor, and we were going through a rebranding campaign around service delivery. And we were trying to change the language and the culture, moving from the word employee to memory makers. So as we hired on new people, a front desk clerk, for example, it wasn't just about, can you check somebody in 4 minutes or less? Because that's the industry standard. It was, how friendly are you? Do you use the guest name, right? So asking some different behavioral interview questions. So this is something for you to think about. And in fact, I encourage you once again to either pause or take a moment here and write down what are a couple of those qualities that you're looking for as you bring people onto your company. That exercise is going to build onto this next exercise around your core values. So this values exercise, all of you should have received a PDF document that you can download with a list of core values on them. And in full transparency, Brené Brown, who I am a huge fan of and all of her work, her latest book called Dare to Lead. If you Google Brené Brown or Dare to Lead, you'll find her Dare to Lead hub of resources where you can download for free things like this values activity. In addition to this values activity, on that website, she also has a Dare to Lead book club kind of worksheet to go along. She also has a how to operationalize your core values activity, which I highly encourage you to use. But first things first, before we think about operationalizing our core values, we have to define what those are. So best practice for organizations are you should have anywhere between 3 to 4 core values. When I worked at Excalibur, as I mentioned earlier, we had 4 core values. MGM Resorts International as an entire company has 3 core values that is expected of everybody. They are teamwork, integrity, and excellence. Now I work at Northern Arizona University, and of course higher ed has to be different. We have 6 core values at Northern Arizona University. They are student-centered, integrity, diversity, service, excellence, and discovery. So what I highly encourage you to do is looking at that value sheet. This is important stuff because core values shouldn't change every 6 months or every year. These are something that maybe you reevaluate every 5 to 10 years. So looking at that sheet of core values, in addition to those qualities that you wrote down that you're looking for in new employees, I would suggest you circling, highlighting, underlining 5 to 7 of those core values. And then once you're ready really to narrowing it down, I would go back, look at that list, and choose the top 3 or 4 core values that you feel best represent who you are, who your company is, and who you want to work with you. Once you have those core values defined as to what they are, now we can move to the next step, which is, what does that value look like? This is where, how do we put that value into practice? So integrity is a core value. Great. What does that mean? What does that look like? This is your opportunity to then link that core value to behaviors. One of the things that the NAU marketing team did with the rollout of those 6 core values was they created I statements. So for example, under integrity, it would say something like, I hold myself to the highest ethical standards. Under excellence, I choose to make every moment count. Under discovery, I embrace and look for new technologies, right? So it's how do I link what that core value is to behaviors. What does that look like in the workplace then? And then the next piece to that, so I have my core values, I have what it looks like, is how do I reinforce and reward those behaviors that I'm looking for? And there's many ways to do that. One is have recognition and incentive programs. In human resources, just in my own department at NAU, every month we have peers vote on each other for who's displaying those core values. We actually have, because we're the NAU Lumberjacks, so we have a tree cookie that's a traveling trophy that goes from office to office for whoever wins. That is a great way to reinforce not only what the core value is, but those behaviors that go along with that core value. An incentive program. You could also link those core values and the behaviors to performance appraisals. So if the mission of your company is here's what we do, here's why we exist, the core values piece is how do we achieve that? How do we get there? That's that earlier when I talked about the Harvard Business Review article, the core values is that culture of what are the group norms and that shared activity. How do we treat each other? How do we treat our customers? So in performance appraisals, we should absolutely be grading people and giving feedback on how well they're doing at exhibiting those behaviors, writing those behaviors into their goals. So I know I've given you quite a bit to think about this morning, hopefully. I just want to end by letting you know that this is your opportunity, and it is an exciting opportunity to create what you want for your company. It's work to do this, but it is meaningful, it is impactful of all the lives that you come in contact with, your employees, your customers, potential customers, you know, the work that you may do in the community. And I'm here to help. Please feel free to reach out to me. You should have my contact information. I think this is so exciting and such an amazing opportunity for then you to build the rest of your human resources functions on. So thank you.
Innovate. It literally means to do something new. It's an action word. It's not just wanting to do something new. It's not just thinking about something new. It's actually doing something new. And that's what Moonshot is all about. Working with entrepreneurs and young companies to help them move from desire and thinking to doing. And it's also what we're all about at TGen, the Translational Genomics Research Institute. Innovation is literally in our DNA. TGen is a nonprofit research institute that is dedicated to advancing human health through next-generation science and technology. So yes, we have a strong desire to improve the human condition and tackle complex diseases like cancer and Alzheimer's, and infectious diseases like COVID and tuberculosis. And yes, we think about new ways to address these problems with 21st century science, but it's the act of doing that makes the difference. Developing and using new diagnostics and therapies to respond to the COVID crisis, using DNA sequencing to map the genetic causes of rare childhood disorders, and developing and testing new treatments for glioblastoma and pancreatic cancer. These things happen because we innovate. At TGen, one of our mottos is, we have the ability, therefore we have the responsibility. Well, we all have the ability to innovate. Therefore, we have the responsibility to make it happen. Not just us at TGen or at Moonshot, but every one of us who has the desire to make a difference in the world. It's innovation that will get us there.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Pierotti. Thanks for joining me today. We're going to talk a little bit about product sales. Just to give you some background on me, I've worked with some amazing companies ranging from Universal Music to working with Jonathan and Drew Scott from Property Brothers, to working with Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation. In all of that, there was a large component of sales, marketing, and licensing. And what we're going to talk a little bit about today are the fundamentals. Although things have changed throughout the years, these are some tips that will help you get started no matter what type of product you're selling. So we want to start with a few assumptions about you and your business. So what are you doing now? So we're assuming going into this that you've had samples made, you have manufacturing lined up, whether that's on demand, small batch, could be domestic, could be imported. It's just very important that you understand your cost of goods going into this process, because that's very important when you're determining your pricing. And we're assuming you have a social presence established and that your website is live. So once you have all of those things lined up, you're almost ready to go. So let's talk a little bit about managing risk. So we want to make sure you're not dumping too much money into your company at the outset without having any secured sales. So we want to make sure that you are well aware of what your inventory on hand needs to be to fulfill orders, and if you're having something made to order, how long it's going to take to actually receive those goods. That way you have a smooth process in your selling cycles. We want to make sure that you can ship samples if you need to. If you're not shipping physical samples, you have a way to replicate that experience in a meaningful way so a buyer would have an understanding of what it is that they're going to purchase. Returns, we want to know how we're going to process returns. If you're going to take returns, that's an important thing to distinguish. And we need to know what chargebacks are. So not all retailers have chargebacks. Some of them make a lot of money off of chargebacks. So basically what's happening here is if your merchandise has been taken on by a retailer and it's not sold and it's marked down, the brunt of the burden of that is going to fall on you. So you need to understand that. And you need to understand what happens if you ship late. Chargebacks could occur because of that as well. And you also need to understand what your overhead is and understanding how you need to build that into your price structure. So let's talk about some selling options. You can sell direct to consumer. That's called B2C, you being the B in that scenario. And then you can sell alternatively or supplementally business to business, so selling to a retailer that's going to then resell to a consumer. So B2C selling options, that's DTC is direct to consumer, so you'll hear that quite a bit when you're talking about selling. So the key challenge is creating demand. So important, no matter how you sell, you have to understand that you have to focus on demand creation. You can't rely solely on a retailer to do that. You have to think through the marketing side, and that's not for everyone. Some people like to just be creative and like to make things, but before you put it out in the world, you need to have a plan for creating demand for those products. That's going to make it more attractive to a retailer as well. You also need to understand drop shipping and EDI. EDI is electronic data, and that is all about exchanging information with a retailer about orders, about fulfillment. So it's important that you understand that if you're dealing with an e-commerce retailer. So your website. If you're just starting in e-commerce, I would highly suggest looking at Squarespace and Shopify. There are a ton of options out there. Those two, I think, are the most user-friendly. And you have to understand the challenges of managing your inventory, having pricing versus what you would price it at a retailer. So you don't want to compete with the retailers that you're selling to if you're selling direct to consumer and selling through a retailer. Generally, what you'll find is that the brand sells their product for a slightly higher price than they would on a retailer site. That makes it more appealing to the retailer to pick up that product. So you don't want to poach your own sales through a retailer. And you need to understand also minimum advertised price. And this is really important with Amazon, as is the pricing, because Amazon will not allow you to sell your product for a price that's less than what Amazon is charging. That's really important to understand before you dive into the Amazon world. So some challenges with some retailers that you may think about using. So with Etsy, you're dealing with rankings and returns. How are you going to process returns if you sell something through Etsy? That's really important. And making sure your page is search engine optimized and that you have a product ranking that's reasonably high when people are searching for a product in the category that you create. Amazon, you're going to deal with rankings, because same issue. You want to make sure your keywords are all there. There's also a lot of fees involved with Amazon, and different products fall in different categories that have different fees related to them. So depending on what you're selling, you're going to pay a different percentage per product category. There's not a blanket fee associated with Amazon, so you have to know the nuances of that. You need to understand how advertising within the Amazon system affects your rankings, and you need to make sure that you have a good grasp on your inventory. Also, again, how you're going to process returns and what minimum advertised pricing is, and understand how the Amazon platform works in that regard. Something to think about if you're looking at selling direct to consumer through offline consumer events. This could be at a festival, it could be in a co-op situation, something like that. You need to think about your booth costs. You need to think about staffing. If you're flying solo and you're a sole proprietor and you want to go have an event and have a booth, you have to make sure you have some backup there and make sure that if you're paying that person, you're building all of these expenses into your pricing. Developing marketing collateral. What are people going to take away with them if they come visit your booth and they don't buy something, or if they do buy something? What is it that they're taking with your brand on it to get them to engage with you after they leave? And then again, how much inventory do you actually need for that event? So something else to think about is social commerce. Instagram has become quite a powerhouse for selling direct to consumer. So if you haven't spent a lot of time thinking about Instagram, I would strongly suggest that you do that. Again, you're looking at fees, so you need to understand what the fees are and what inventory needs you have to be selling on that platform. Some quick facts about selling on Instagram are here, but basically we're saying that Instagram is a large marketplace. There are a lot of consumers engaging with it, so your audience is probably already there. So if you can sell your product directly to them through that platform, then it's definitely worth considering. So there are other options if you're selling to a retailer, such as virtual showrooms. So there used to just be the method of going to a trade show, showing your wares, hoping you got an order there, and sending the order to the retailer. Retailer then sells it to the consumer. There's another scenario, and this is specific to fashion, but there are virtual e-commerce marketplaces where buyers can go, especially important now in the middle of a pandemic, that we can't go to trade shows and we can't do all the brand engagement things that we used to do, so we have to find new ways to do that. So there are industry-specific e-commerce marketplaces where you can go and have your brand represented in a virtual environment. So something else to think about if you're thinking about selling to a retailer or you have a specific retailer in mind. You can do it yourself. You can try to get your foot in the door and go find the right buyer, or you can find a sales rep that has an existing relationship with that particular retailer, or a series of retailers that you're interested in, or a particular territory that you want to be in. So you have to understand that you're going to pay commission to those folks, but you're also sharing expenses with other brands. So you're getting a little more bang for your buck with marketing, but you're not going to be front and center. You're sharing that in kind of a co-op situation. So a physical showroom, a trade show booth, travel, these are all things that you might have additional expenses for with that sales rep. So you also want to know if you, again, if you're looking for a specific retail presence, you want to find a sales rep that has an existing relationship with that retailer. So that makes it worth the commission that you would potentially pay them. And there are retailer-specific sales groups. You just need to do a little research online to find that specific retail and retailer and what group deals with them specifically. And there's territory-specific ones too. So you may have 5 different sales reps that cover 5 different territories, each of them having specific needs. But you would, again, be paying a commission to each one of them. So something else to consider, and this dives a little bit into the world of licensing, which is another subject, which there's another workshop on. So there's a private label situation in which your brand would be licensed to a retailer brand, and from a consumer side, it looks like a collaboration. So this requires some element of exclusivity from you. A retailer is not going to give you a private label deal if you have product in a competing retailer. So this requires inventory and marketing commitment from the retailer. So you wouldn't want to give up exclusivity at a retailer unless they're really willing to get behind it in a meaningful way. So just some notes about licensing. Again, there's another workshop on this if you want to dive into that a little bit more. So the licensor is the IP owner, and that would be you if you were making your product. The licensee is the manufacturer or retailer. So that's the person who's either making the product or retailing the product to consumers. So DTR, again, is direct to retail, and the traditional licensing relationship is a licensor working with the manufacturer. But there are situations in which the licensor or the brand owner would work with a retailer who then secures the manufacturing from their existing manufacturing vendors. So it's important to understand here who owns the brand. So if you're giving up the rights to your brand, that's something you need to be mindful of when you're entering into these deals, that you're not giving up too much control of your brand. And something else to be aware of is a diffusion brand. So understanding what that is. So we want to make sure, it's also called a bridge line. So Vera Wang is not known primarily for her line at Kohl's, but her higher priced items came first. And it's important that that's understood, because it's easier to start a diffusion brand after you have a major brand and then create a lower price point brand that's more accessible. So Simply Vera by Vera Wang at Kohl's is a good example of that. So understanding active involvement versus what we call label slapping. So that would be a passive situation in which you're just lending your brand and you're not actively involved in product development. You're just letting the retailer do what they want to do, and you're just basically lending your name to it. So let's talk about making the sale. So we want to talk a little bit about demand generation, tools and terms, working with buyers, and we'll talk a little bit about trade shows, which have changed a lot in the last year. So making the sale, demand generation is important. So what are you doing to generate demand? This is what retail buyers are going to want to know. If you're just hoping that they take the brunt of that work, that's not going to be very appealing to them. They need to know that your brand is relevant and that you're actively engaging with the audience to create demand for a product before they would pull it in. Also looking at the DIY competitive landscape analysis. So go in there and do some research before you meet with the buyer. That's really important to understand what the competitive landscape looks like. So you need to understand that the people, brands and retailers with proven sales that you respect and admire, what are they doing? What can you do that's not exactly the same as what they're doing but makes you competitive with them? So a question you'll get a lot from a retail buyer is, who's working with your brand? Where else do you have a presence? If it's online, offline, what does that look like? Are you working with influencers? Did you have product placement in something? That's all something that they'll want to talk about. So understand that working with social influencers is becoming more and more important. You can do it yourself and go through all the social channels and figure out where your audience is engaging, who they're listening to, what is actually influencing them. Or there are agencies like Trendsetter, fantastic agency out of New York, that can help you put your product in front of the right influencers and manages that for you. There's a difference between paid and organic placement. And there are a lot of FTC regulations around paid placement, so that's something you want to be aware of if you start working with influencers. Organic placement is something that an influencer genuinely likes your product. They want to talk about it because they're passionate about it. That's the best situation you want to be in, not have something that seems forced or hashtag ad, and it's something that somebody was paid to actually promote. It seems insincere. Social content development, that's something that you need to make sure that you're making buyers aware of before you engage with them as well, because they, again, want to know that you're generating demand for your products. So are you going to get your products in front of consumers, buyers, celebrity stylists, media? What are you actually doing to promote your product actively? Advertorial is a term that basically means If you buy an ad in a magazine, they'll also write an editorial story about you. So generally not something that's advertised, but as you enter into that world, you'll learn more about that. Editorial calendar development. So it's important that when you're developing social content for your products, that you have a good mix of kind of behind the scenes stuff, lifestyle shots, things that customers have shared, and call to action. So you don't just want to have the social content be sell, sell, sell. It seems pushy. You're going to lose followers. It's not something that people engage with in the same way that they feel like they're relating to something. So you have to be very careful about making it seem too salesy. So tools that you need when you go into a situation in which you're selling your products, you want to have a sales sheet, and you want to have at least some representation of this, if not the physical pieces, then something that shows a mock-up of something. So talk a little bit about your brand, and assume you're going to leave this behind. You might not be able to get the meeting with the buyer that you want. It may get passed on to somebody else, so this should be a pretty comprehensive package. Talk about your brand, what the labels look like, what the packaging looks like. If they're hang tags, anything like that that is showing your brand, that needs to be displayed in this as well. Any media coverage that you have, little clips, any kind of numbers about social engagement, that type of thing. And if you have established sales channels for your products, this is the right time to brag about that. So line sheets are something else that you want to have in kind of your arsenal of tools that you take in to meet with a buyer. A line sheet should have all of your styles, colors, and sizes available. It's important that the colors match. So if you haven't worked a lot with colors, if you look at a color that's printed out versus on a screen versus printed out and holding it in the sun versus artificial light, all the colors are going to look different in each of those things. So it's really important that you're communicating in something like a Pantone color number so people can understand what the actual color is. And that has to mesh potentially with a larger collection that the retailer's putting together, so you want to make sure that you're really accurate in your color. You want to include style numbers in there as well. So you also want to put a suggested retail price. It doesn't mean that's what they're going to sell it for, but that's your suggested retail price. And you also want to put what a wholesale price is. Now, that's going to be probably negotiated by that buyer, but it's good to have a starting point for that conversation. A word that you might hear when you're talking to buyers is keystoning. That's generally 100% markup and a 50% gross margin. Making sure that discounts are factored into costing. You don't want to start out too low, because if you look, for example, we were talking about Kohl's. If you look at the Kohl's model, everything's on sale all the time. So they're going to be changing that a lot, and you want to make sure that you're starting at a point where if discounts are applied, you're not killing your margins. So generally speaking, again, this is different for different industries, but you don't want to go below 35% gross margin. So if you don't have physical products, or you have too many physical products to wheel into a meeting with a buyer, have drawings, CADs, or photos, something that you can show to represent your line. Order forms are generally left behind. This applies more to boutique retailers, things like that. When you get into larger retailers, they're going to have automated systems. But it's important for you to understand what the terms are when you come into a meeting like this, so you can have an educated conversation with the buyer. So EOM is end of month. Net 30 means that the payment is due 30 days from the ship date. So if you're talking about 10 net 30, there's a lot of different terms that just, again, know what this is before you go into those meetings. What terms should you offer? Do a little bit of research on a retailer if you're not familiar with them, to make sure that they'll be able to pay you. That's the important part. So a little bit more about order forms. There can be discounts offered if someone pays cash. So that would be a retailer paying cash to you as the person who's providing the product. If there's a trade industry discount, if there's a quantity discount, seasonal. Again, this will mostly apply when you're talking about smaller retailers, boutique retailers. And make sure that when you're talking to the buyer, if there are changes to the PO that they've issued, that everything's in writing. What you don't want to do is go back and say, well, you said when we talked on this day, document everything. If you're having a conversation over the phone, send a follow-up email so you have everything in writing. And make sure you understand your transportation terms. So a little bit more about transportation terms. So FOB factory means that the buyer pays for the transportation. FOB destination means that the seller pays for the transportation and owns the product till it's received by the buyer. And this is really important for insurance purposes. FOB shipping point means that the seller pays transportation and owns until it's received by the shipping company. Again, all of these things are really important because who owns the product at what time makes it make more sense when you start talking about insurance and how long you have to insure those pieces until they arrive. FOB DCR means destination charges reversed. So that means the seller owns the goods, that you own the goods, until they're received by the buyer, and then the buyer pays for the transportation. And then we have DFP, which means destination freight paid. Again, it's important that you know these because you have to really know, not only for insurance purposes, but what your landed cost of goods are, and that should really determine your pricing. So you have to understand every nickel that you're investing in this process so you know whether or not your margins are appropriate. So a little bit more about working with buyers. Again, if you're going to show up in person, have a meeting with the buyer, make sure you have samples, make sure that when you're showing the line, everything, if it's a garment, that it's steamed, it's showing in a way that is in the best light for that product. Again, if you're working with boutiques, if you're working with a larger retailer, you have to have an appointment. You can't just pop in. But if you're doing pop-ins with smaller retailers, make sure you have a succinct elevator pitch and that you can get your point across quickly and make them want to talk to you further. You need to have some leave behinds because the person you are talking to may or may not be there. But if they are there, you have to be prepared to pitch. So make sure that you show up prepared, not saying, well, I thought I'd just stop by and I didn't know you were going to be here. Make sure that you're prepared to actually have that meeting. So in a virtual environment, some terms to know about and be able to talk to a buyer about, A+ content is really important. And what that means is that it's not just still images of a product. I'm sure you're used to seeing that on Amazon and different platforms. What you'll see more now, and you'll actually have retailers demanding this, is A+ content. You're trying to mimic an in-person experience. So you're showing on furniture a drawer being pulled out. If it's a soft close, you show the soft close. If it's a feature in a garment, you want to actually interact with that garment the way that a customer would if they had that piece in their hand. So anything that you can do, especially voiceovers to guide, make sure you just have some multimedia components to that and be able to talk about A+ content when you're meeting with the buyer. So if you're having a conversation with a larger retailer, they're probably going to expect you to have that, so be prepared. And that is something you'll probably have to pay for, but it's worth it because it actually translates into more sales if it's done appropriately. And you want to have digital versions of printed sales tools so that you can email, follow up with emails, and make sure that everything that you would have printed out if you were in a physical meeting can be sent in a digital way. So trade shows, I'm going to put an asterisk by this because trade shows aren't happening as they were right now, and they may never be the same again. So we just have to be flexible around this, but you have to understand your industry-specific show schedule because that generally determines a lot of the buying cycles, and you want to know that for your industry. So they may, a buyer may be holding on to their open to buy until a trade show happens because they're expecting to pick up new product at a trade show. So just know that things like that happen. Preparing for a virtual event, it's really important. I've attended in the last couple of months several virtual conferences. One of them was a lot like speed dating. So it was a 10-minute meeting, and then you have a 5-minute break, and then you go into a 10-minute meeting, and it's like that nonstop for 2 days. So you have to be able to, over and over and over again, have your elevator pitch ready and be willing to present that enthusiastically for 2 days, and then make sure that you're following up quickly with all of these people, because just as you met a ton of people, everyone else met a ton of people. So making sure that you follow up and reinforce the message during your initial conversation is very important. And again, be sure you're respectful of people's time. If you're doing some of these virtual events, show up at the meeting time. Don't be late. It's really important that you make the most of everyone's time and they don't feel like their time's being wasted. And again, follow up quickly. Connect with that person on LinkedIn. Send the digital assets. Just make sure you said, hi, thanks for your time, something like that. It's really important that quick follow-up happens, because you don't want to go back a month later. I don't know if you remember me, but we met at this thing. So it's really important that you do that quickly. So another thing to understand about trade shows is seasonality. So the seasonality of the consumer buying cycle is different than the buyer's buying cycle. So they're going to buy things far ahead, sometimes a year or year and a half before the consumer would actually have their hands on that. So it's important that you understand the buyer's buying schedule so that you can speak their language. And understand trend forecasting. That's what the buyers are looking at. So it could be things that are happening in the marketplace, just understanding the economics of the situation. Or it could be color-specific trends, industry trends. Just be aware of what's going on in your industry and be able to speak to that. Juried shows, if you hear that term, that means that there is a group of people that is assessing whether or not someone can participate in a show. You'll get that a lot in apparel shows in the fashion world. So rather than anybody just being able to buy a booth space, there's someone going through these products first and making sure that they're basically up to par for what's happening at that show. There are order writing shows and there are brand building shows. So know going into it, if you can't go around demanding orders, if it's a brand building show, that's just not the environment to participate in that kind of behavior. So you want to make sure that if it's a brand building show, you have collateral to distribute. If it's an order writing show, be ready to take orders and talk about terms. Understand that there will be canceled orders. This happens a lot in the apparel world too. You'll have buyers, as they're going through the show, placing orders without the intention of actually following up on all of those orders. So they'll go back, they'll place a ton of orders and cancel maybe half of them, knowing that they only have X amount of open to buy, but they just take their favorites at the end of the trade show period and cancel the rest. So just because you get an order on your first day doesn't mean that a week later you're still going to have that order. And again, follow up, follow up, follow up. Make sure you're following up in a timely manner. So some resources for you. Here's a bit about Instagram shopping. Again, you can download this presentation so you don't have to jot all this down here. There are a couple of different sales and marketing tools. This is a great resource for if you're starting to engage in online sales. You can use one platform and sell through all of these different social channels. Doug Stevens, excellent person to follow. He does a podcast as well. He has 2 books coming out that'll be really interesting. They're coming out in spring of 2021, talking about re-engineering retail for the post-pandemic world and what retail is going to look like when this is all over. Retail Dive is another great website to pay attention to, talking about retail trends. And then we have the NRF, that is, they call themselves the voice of retail, and they really are, have their finger on the pulse of what's happening in the retail world. Business Insider and Fast Company, also good ones to pay attention to. So here's all my contact information. If you have any questions, want to chat about any of this, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, email me, call me. Happy to talk to you about any of this stuff. Now, go start something.
Video production services for makers and shakers provided by Moonshot Studios, powered by PDR Digital Media.